Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. I am Constantine Martelli. Now, GSP unfortunately could not join us due to technical issues and scheduling conflicts on both of our ends. So I'm going to just continue forward, give you a brief overview of the week's news, and it probably will be a little bit of a shorter show because any of you who have ever done something like this can probably attest. It does not take as long to do something like this when you're monologuing, and it can actually get kind of stale when you're listening to somebody just monologue. So I'll try not to drone on about one thing too much, but when you only have one person instead of two or three, there's nobody to really bounce off of. You don't really get to have that dialogue, which I think is one of the stronger suits of this show and shows like it. But I will continue forward to just give you some brief updates and my opinion on those. And then when we have GSP back, we can, of course, review some of the stories and continue on with the news stories that develop, of course, between now and then. But I'll give you a brief Ukraine update. Now, it won't be as detailed as our normal ones because GSP has a particular talent for being able to just describe what's happening on the front. I have tried my best to replicate that, but just some basic notes I have right here on the front in Ukraine, moving from south to north as we usually do. So there has been no significant advances on the Kherson front. Now, a village of Gorno-Zdayevka has been shelled by the AFU. Russia has hit ammo depots, and there has just been shelling along the front as well. There have been continued shellings in Ugledar by Russian forces. We have progress into the city limits of Marinka, and also along the Donbass front, as I'm sure many of you have heard. Bakhmut has been a center of intense fighting, and actually just now of recording this, it has been reported that Russia has taken the heights and the outskirts of Bakhmut city. There's also been fighting on the outskirts of Idayevka, and the Russians did hit a Ukrainian command post there. Ukrainian shelling has continued in the Donbass, including Donetsk City, Yakovlevka, and other surrounding villages, and there were HIMARS strikes on Anakievo. Now, moving on briefly to the northern front, we have artillery strikes in Novoselovskoye, Olshana, and Durchenaya. Now, forgive me if any of my pronunciations are off. I am not the Slav of the War Report pair, so let's just say my pronunciations aren't necessarily as refined as my good friend GSP, but that was a very brief Ukraine update. Now, just give my thoughts on the situation before getting into some of the broader Ukraine news. Is what we see right now, many are calling the Russian winter offensive. Now, I know winter is going to be over in about a month and a half, maybe just shy of. But I would hazard not to call this an offensive. I do think this is something of a probing into Ukraine. Of course, playing off the dynamics of the West, there have been just about everything under the sun you'd expect coming out from the West, whether it be we're going to pledge more aid to Ukraine really needs to back off here, to Ukraine really needs to uh, pick up the pace, and it has become a much less popular enterprise to be 100% on board with Ukraine, even as a politician in most Western countries. Now, there are exceptions in places like Poland and the Baltic states where they are very adamant to see this conflict continue, very adamant to see Russia at least hopefully weakened from their perspective. But with that being said, when it comes to the major Western players, think U.S., France, UK. I would scratch that. I wouldn't count the UK necessarily in that because they do seem a bit more hawkish on this compared to their counterparts. But U.S., France, Germany, there's been a lot of hemming and hawing, for lack of a better term, with what to do on the Ukrainian situation. So I believe what we're seeing here is Russia is once again playing a slow game with these slower advances before going on to an offensive. Now, there are some people who speculate, even on the pro Russia side, I suppose you would say, saying that they don't think the offensives would happen. There have been some internal disputes within the Russian military at this time. The Russian Ministry of Defense are trying to throttle supplies to the Wagner Group, which, for those of you who have been keeping up with the war, the Wagner Group has been doing much of the heavy lifting when it comes to these offensives. And I'll get into some of the casualty reports and why I don't necessarily believe those are entirely accurate when it comes to both Wagner and the Russian armed forces in general. But we do have also broader news in Ukraine about the strikes on infrastructure do continue with missile strikes in Lvov, Kremenchug, and Kropyvnytsky. There was a prisoner exchange where the Russians did return 100 prisoners of war and one civilian to Ukraine. There has also been some interesting news about Crimea. There's been this back and forth between the U.S. and Ukraine in particular, where, of course, you have Washington, you have Blinken, you have Biden. They pledge to send these longer range weapons, these longer range missiles to Ukraine, but you have Blinken out and about, Anthony Blinken, wonderful man, as I'm sure you all know, saying that the U.S. isn't going to tell Ukraine not to advance on Crimea, but it is a Russian red line, and they would be, quote unquote, on their own if they were to continue that advance. Now, I think any talk of an offensive on the Crimea front is a bit premature insofar as Ukraine is concerned, but there have been explosions near and in Crimea as well as of today. But it the story also reveals something that I think we all already knew, is that much of the Ukrainian military activity is being directed by the West and NATO, as per Blinken's statements about Ukraine being quote-unquote on its own if it crosses that Russian red line. So, it does also create a bit of a strange dynamic when it comes to the narrative where Crimea is Ukraine, it's always been Ukrainian, we recognize Ukrainian territorial sovereignty, and we're helping Ukraine defend its nation, but we're not going to help it liberate Crimea. It is a tacit admission that Crimea is a part of Russia now. Everyone accepts this, everyone behaves as this is the case, but maybe they won't sign the official documentation to recognize the annexation, but after a certain point, actions, as cliche it is, do speak louder than words, and when you behave as if Crimea is part of Russia, which it functionally is, regardless of what Ukrainians or the UN or international law or whoever else or whatever else might say, it's part of Russia at this point. It has been integrated into Russia. You could say it was part of Russia before. I would make that argument, of course, but any attachment Ukraine had to Crimea at this point has been more or less severed. Now, I don't know, maybe there's some massive Ukrainian sleeper cell waiting to take back the peninsula from the inside. Who knows what kind of a cape shit fantasy has been concocted by a lot of these people, but insofar as that's concerned, I mean, it's a done deal. The Ukrainians, I doubt, are going to go as far as trying to seize Crimea. Not that I think they would be able to. That would be the point in which I think Russia would take this to a quote-unquote total war scenario. Now, there are many who speculate, and I do sympathize with that, even on the pro-Russian side. I'm talking about people that, particularly inside of Russia, I have talked to about this. I'm not going to name any names, just in case they don't want me repeating anything, but repeating anything and attributing to them, I should say, now. But some of the narrative I see from the pro-Russia side within Russia and that part of the world in general. There's a few non-Russians, but people who would be generally sympathetic. But many speculate that even if Crimea was under threat, you would still get the very half-assed response from the Kremlin. Judging by some of the news that came out of Kherson, which, of course, Kherson was formally annexed into the Russian Federation last fall, and then you had the withdrawal of Russian forces. And many took that as a very foreboding and negative sign, which, once again, understandable, which made them think that this war could go all the way to Crimea and that Crimea could be at risk. But I can just say, pure gut feeling, Russia would formalize this military operation into an actual war if Crimea were under any serious threat. But that will have to be sat on. We'll have to sleep on that and wait and see what actually happens. Now, I do believe within the next few weeks, perhaps, if you want to buy into what the mainstream media is saying about the quote-unquote symbolism, perhaps it will be around the year anniversary of the war, which is coming up next week. We'll actually see the major Russian offensive, but I do think that is in the works because while time is far more favorable to Russia than it is to Ukraine or even arguably the West, it still is a very valuable asset, and stretching on this war any longer than it needs to be is a very risky enterprise, especially considering the solution to a war like this is rather unclear, and it doesn't exactly lend itself to straightforward analysis. I'm sure the audience of this show knows, especially after following this for almost a year. And the last story I have out of Ukraine in general is many people are expecting the war to expand into Transnistria, especially upon the rumblings in Moldova with fears of a quote-unquote Russian coup underway, as Sandu does allege, President Sandu of Moldova does allege that Russia is trying to quote-unquote overthrow her government, which they very well may be, but at a certain point you can't really be surprised. It would be, frankly, a bit of a delayed reaction with the past, 20 years of color revolutions from everywhere from Georgia to Ukraine to attempts in Belarus and even attempts in Kazakhstan, as we've seen in the past year and a half or so, past year and a half. So even if this is a Russian attempt at a color revolution, it does seem that Russia is a bit late to have joined in on this. Perhaps they are picking up on it. Now, I don't think it would be a bad thing at all if they quote-unquote succeed in that, if Sandu got knocked from power, being I believe she had connections either to the WEF or World Bank, but at that point it's a distinction from that, a difference. One just much more easily to point the finger at, that being the WEF. They're sort of the punching bag, not to defend anyone there, but they are more or less put out there to be the lightning rod of criticisms when it comes to other globalist projects and institutions. They're kind of low on the ladder, at least in my opinion. So, but point being is, if you're that in bed with them, if you're that tied to them, it's not really a good thing, and that's something that should be held against you. But with that out of the way, it is suspected that there will be offensives on the Transnistria front with cooperation from both Moldova and Ukraine. I think that is yet to be seen. I do think it would be a not very rational decision at this time, because of course there are Russian forces in Transnistria, about 1,000, but even they are quote unquote there under official international law. So they're peacekeeping forces. They're technically authorized to be there. Not that I put too much stock whenever international law is saying that, of course, Russian forces are going to be there. It's a pocket of ethnic Russian diaspora that was up until very recently part of the same polity as the Russian state under the Soviet Union. Now, calling the Soviet Union a Russian state, yeah, I know, is a bit of a misnomer, but you get the point here. But opening up a front in Transnistria when there is a potential major Russian offensive on the line doesn't exactly seem like a logical decision at this point, which I don't think will happen, don't get me wrong. But there is the speculation around that. But getting into Moldova, Sandu has alleged after protests against her government as a result of the economic woe and the instability caused by this war that Russia is trying to topple the Moldova government. Now, the protests do continue. Like I said, I wouldn't be shocked if there's any sort of Russian support for these, and as I would say, it probably is a very logical decision to make when it comes to the current environment around the world right now. And the media wants to make this into much more of a story than it is. I don't think Moldova's government is going to collapse at all, but they're going to write off any discontent as some sort of pro Russia or Russian backed coup. And what happens from there is really anyone's guess at that point. But I maintain that, especially with how close Moldova is to the European Union and how close it is to Ukraine, that it is more or less lost to the Russian sphere. As for the fate of Transnistria, I do think that is heavily contingent on the fate of the war in Ukraine. Let's say Russia does get the wonderful victory where it takes all of the quote unquote Novorossiya up to Odessa and everything and has that border with Transnistria, then it has a fighting chance to survive. But if Russia accepts some sort of other peace, or if the peace comes out in some sort of other way, but anything that prevents a land border between Russia and Transnistria probably spells doom for Transnistria, even if it has not been that much of a threat, even if it has been something that has been dormant for 30 years at this point. They're not going to tolerate another quote unquote Russian breakaway province in any nation after what happened in Ukraine, and that they will crack down harshly on that, which also does raise the question what will happen to the Russian diaspora populations in places outside of the current Russian borders and within the former Soviet Union. Think the Baltic states in particular, they've had that struggle. And I could see out of any countries in the former Soviet Union, the Baltic states really taking to maybe similar anti-Russian language laws as we've seen in Ukraine, or attempts to assimilate the populations, and again trying to once again emulate what Ukraine has been doing since 2014 on a much smaller scale, which is much more likely to be successful. But we'll see as that goes. But out of everything, I do think that is probably the most likely scenario in a Russian loss or victory, or somewhere in between. Regardless of the outcome of the war, there will be sentiments against these Russian diaspora populations that have been there since the Soviet Union, or even earlier in some cases. So that will be that'll open a lot of doors. It'll be an interesting situation to see if Russia responds the same way they did in, say, Ukraine. Now, Ukraine, you could argue, is a bit of a different situation with how strategically positioned it is, and even the cultural and civilizational value it has to Russia, as well as the, of course, ethnic populations that openly identified as Russians that were in Ukraine. While you do have those, once again, in places like Moldova, places like the Baltic states, etc., they aren't to the same degree as integrated with Russia as, say, Ukraine is, where maybe they'll offer some sort of fast track citizenship like they did to the citizens of the Donbass back in, what was that, 2019, 2020. But I don't see Russia risking war with a NATO state over its diaspora populations. Now, whether you think it should or not, I mean, fair enough, that's your opinion, but in terms of what I actually think will happen, not what I should think happen, I don't think that there will be a war risk over anything with having to involve a NATO state, at least at the time being. Now, if this war does actually prove to be a, let's just say, death nail to NATO, which I think that the people who say NATO has never been stronger, but also the people who say that it's on the brink of collapse, are simultaneously right. I think we are at a crucial crossroads where, depending on how the next few years go, especially when it comes to European-American relations and the situation regarding Russia and the outcome of this war, or if it's still ongoing. That will be the key determinant on whether NATO will be solidified into a complete subjugation by the U.S., even more so than it already is, or whether it will be something that starts to fray apart. Now, as we cover in our European news segment every week, more and more you have these blocks of what are admittedly smaller nations start to peel away, start to go against the party line in NATO, whether that be Hungary, Croatia, Slovakia. I suppose Serbia isn't really in the EU or NATO, but again, Serbia, Bulgaria. But you have these smaller nations. Now, I would say all of them are. I would say none of them are insignificant, but they certainly aren't the major players of NATO. But you do have this growing block of discontent. You have even the more adamantly pro-Ukraine leaders not sending weapons into Ukraine. But with that being said, we'll just knock out some European news right here before getting into some of the big stories about the train derailment, about the quote-unquote UFO stories. But just to briefly knock that out, when it came to this most recent sanctions package that is being imposed on Russia by the European Union, you had France and Hungary actually work together to block sanctions on the Russian nuclear industry. Now, once again showing that Europe is still heavily dependent on Russian energy resources, even in the absence of oil and natural gas. Many people, when this first started, I would say rightfully so, accosted Germany for its decommission of its nuclear power plants. But one thing several people have gotten wrong since the start of this war is that Germany surrendered itself to energy dependence on Russia when it decommissioned its nuclear power plants. That's simply not the case, because when you have a country like France that still imports massive amounts of oil from Russia, or at least did up until the current war, but just massive amounts of oil in general, one of the biggest oil importers in the European Union, you still have the European nuclear industry dependent on Russia. Now, that's not just for a fuel source, because there are other countries with uranium. There's the US, there's Canada, there's Australia, there's Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, another country that has found itself as a major target for color revolutions. There's Nigeria, there's places in Africa. Point being is, nuclear fuel is not the primary concern. It is a concern, but it's not the primary concern. Much of what's manufactured to actually keep these plants online and even build them in the first place is manufactured out of Russia. And it is, once again, a major trump card they have over the Europeans, because at this point, even with all the energy restrictions, all the gas caps, whatever they've tried to impose on Russia, they have not touched the nuclear industry. Now, they're starting to move towards that, but that is going to be a red line, even for countries like France, which, admittedly, France has always played the, I guess you could say, devil's advocate, where, of course, they've always been on the quote-unquote right team as far as the West is concerned, but they're the ones willing to say, well, we can't fight Russia forever. We're supporting Ukraine, but we're not in a war with Russia, and give the more tempered statements, if you will, as compared to, say, the rabble coming out of somewhere like Poland, the Baltic states, or even the UK for that matter, or the US for that matter as well. But that is going to be, in my opinion, a very hard red line for much of the European Union when it comes to threatening the cooperation of the nuclear industry. And although the US, of course, does have nuclear power, does have nuclear power plants, and probably does to some degree have the capacity to manufacture what is needed to keep the industry online in Europe, the question is, can they produce it in large enough quantities, and will they produce it in large enough quantities if they can? In which case, I would be more inclined to say no at this point. As we've seen consistently, the U.S. is trying to strip Europe down to its bare bones, trying to keep it just barely above the water, just trying to keep it just barely alive. Just barely alive in, say, a first world sense. They're not trying to take it down to third world levels. I mean, in some ways they are, but like not in the most primary ways that you'd expect. Now, when it comes to the whole migration issue, that's entirely another question that we could get into another day, but I think you get my point here. But I don't foresee the U.S. swooping in to save the European nuclear industry, even if they can, without some sort of major concession. Some sort of major concession that Europe probably will accept, but it is going to be an uphill battle to the point where even cooperation with Russia is probably going to come with less strings attached at this point, which once again doesn't really bode well for the unity of Europe and the strength of NATO and Western countries and democracies and all the same drivel that you've been hearing at least since 2022, if not earlier, if you have been paying attention. Now, moving back to Ukraine a bit, we have some news with Hungary when it comes to Ukraine, where Hungary and Romania have lodged a complaint with the European Union in particular, and they tried to go to all these human rights councils, all these shell global organizations that exist. Now, admittedly, those are really the only channels, and I don't think, for example, I don't think Orban and Giarto think that it's really going to accomplish anything by... I don't think they think that the European courts or the European Union is going to suddenly decide, well, Ukraine is violating minority rights and we're so principled that we're actually going to stand up to this. But it does call into question the blind support for Ukraine. It does call into question the direction of European politics, even by vocalizing the issue. But you've had cooperation between Hungary and Romania to once again denounce the treatment of their ethnic minorities within Ukraine. And this has been an ongoing concern for Hungary especially since the beginning of the war, and even more recently for Romania. Now, the Romanian government, since the start of the war, has towed the line a bit more. Now, not entirely, but they have been a lot more compliant than Hungary. Hungary is the least compliant nation within the European Union, probably the only less compliant nation in Europe, that excluding Serbia and Belarus, because, of course, they would take second and first place respectively when it comes to that, especially Belarus, which is almost integrated with Russia at this point. And this also is coupled with Zhyarto paying a visit to Belarus, which is the first visit of his to Belarus. And while Hungary has had cooperation and strong diplomacy with Russia since even before the start of the war, even they have not touched the Belarus issue. Belarus has been much easier to target, as you saw with the 2020 color revolution, because it's a much smaller nation. Although it is heavily integrated with Russia, it still is not fully integrated with Russia, so there is a backdoor of vulnerability in there. And even a country like Hungary, which is a bit more renegade, didn't really touch the issue when it came to Belarus, didn't really try to make inroads with them. But as this continues, as Europe continues to drive itself further and further into the ground, we have, right now, another country turning eastward. Now, will this end up with a following of suit of, say, maybe Milanovic will next go to Belarus? Now, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but as the situation deteriorates, I do think we really have to ask ourselves the question, will more and more countries start to extend that hand out to, maybe not necessarily Belarus in particular, but other blacklisted nations, if you will? Will we start to see more renegades within the European Union? I do think that this year will be the year that determines this. And by the end of 2023, I'm not going to say we're going to have a definitive picture, but I do think we'll have a pretty good picture of whether we're looking at a properly multipolar world or the 1,000-year Burger Reich, as some may call it. But that is, once again, although Belarus is not that significant of a nation outside of its connection to Russia, it still is a bold move to see just any foreign minister of a European Union country go there, and under friendly terms, no less. So we'll continue to monitor that situation, and perhaps we'll have a better insight on that in the coming weeks. But just a a few more brief stories out of Europe. Now, this also involves Hungary, and this involves Zelensky's visit to the special European Council meeting in Brussels. And he was invited there to be alongside European Union member states as well as members of the European Council. And they gave him the most fawning welcome. They had the quite literal red carpet for him. He came up, he was met with adoration, and there was actually a very interesting photo op of the heads of state or heads of government of the European Union nations gathering around Zelensky, shaking his hand and smiling. And then you just have Orban standing off to the side with a very sour look on his face. And that was a picture's worth 1,000 words, as they say, with these countries fawning around Zelensky. But you have Orban just standing there in complete defiance, and he didn't clap, he didn't smile, he didn't go along with any of the spectacle. And it did also come out later that you had the Chancellor of Austria, Karl Nehammer, and the President of Romania, Klaus Iohannis, also were not participating in the spectacle, and they were actually closer to Orban. So, although it did appear at first that Orban was a lone dissenter, much more encouragingly, we did see that there were a couple of other holdouts. I mean, I can't imagine, I don't know if he was there, I can't imagine Milanovic would have been too enthused to have been at an event like that and clap and smile and shake Zelensky's hand, so that was an interesting story, starting to show some of the fracturing in Europe, of course. You do have that developing bloc we've been covering of Austria, Hungary, Croatia, to an extent Slovakia, Serbia, and also to an extent Bulgaria. And it does appear, with some recent moves in the past few weeks, now I can't speak too certainly, that Romania does seem to be drifting towards that bloc as well, in terms of being a more dissenting European Union country and starting to become less enthused with the situation around Ukraine. Now, on the other end of so-called populist countries, I'm sure you'll recall the V4 that was very much the talk of many on the, I guess you could say, broadly populist or dissident right, where you had the coalition between Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. No stronger divorce, I would say, has been cemented in that than the division between Poland and Hungary, especially when it comes to this war. So Poland has now reinstated the draft for both men and women. And that can be attributed probably to what they suspect is going to be an expansion in conflict. And we'll get into some of Stoltenberg's comments in a moment here. But this is also on top of military expansion in general to Poland. You'll also recall that upon sending its old fleet of tanks to Ukraine during this, Poland had requested a one-for-one compensation from Germany with Leopard tanks as it cleared out its arsenal of old Soviet tanks. So, while they did want to, of course, fuel the Ukrainian war effort, it was very self-interested as they also wanted to modernize their arsenal. So, it has been suspected for a while Poland is going to try to play a much greater role in this war, and that I do think the longer this war is dragged out, the more risk you run of nations like Poland forming a coalition and intervening themselves. Now, not necessarily a full NATO intervention, but a NATO-supported intervention by members acting outside of the treaty. So Article 5, of course, wouldn't apply, so you wouldn't have it boil into a full-scale conflict. Once again, touching on what George Soros said, that we need to convince the Eastern Europeans to march off and fight the Russians for us, and it looks like he has succeeded in that, at least to a degree. And Stoltenberg has made comments regarding the state of Ukrainian-NATO relations that at this time Ukraine should not be admitted into NATO, and that NATO should also be preparing for a larger conflict with Russia, but also making comments that establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine would be a declaration of war on Russia. So when you read between the lines and put all of Stoltenberg's statements together, what you can see is NATO is anticipating a war with Russia in fact, in the words of Stoltenberg, many years down the road, but are trying to delay that for as long as possible and trying to rearm for as long as possible. Which, given some of the statements and some of the performance that has come out of the NATO countries, especially when it comes to providing military aid to Ukraine, it is understandable. I do think Stoltenberg is somebody who has actually kept awake at night by the underpreparedness of NATO for this conflict, which are also bolstered by the words of Ben Wallace, the Secretary of Defense of the United Kingdom, who said that in the case of a full-scale war, the UK would run through its ammo reserves in a matter of 5 days. So, when it comes to that, NATO is grossly underprepared for war. While you can criticize the Russian performance in this war, while you can go down that rabbit hole, say they've underperformed, say they're incompetent, whatever, point being is, coming straight from the horse's mouth, now, who knows, this could be a massive deception campaign, but I suspect not. But coming straight from the horse's mouth, we've had NATO admit that it is not prepared for a conflict with Russia at this point. And I do think some of that is fear-mongering in order to increase military spending and military production in member nations, but I do think there is a rather large kernel of truth in that Stoltenberg is trying to prepare for the worst situation, which he does see as inevitable, in which case I would actually have to agree with him. NATO and Russia will come to blows at some point in, I wouldn't say the near future, but in the foreseeable future, there probably will be, to some degree, a NATO-Russia conflict. As much as you may or may not consider this a NATO-Russia conflict, but in terms of a more direct confrontation between the two power blocks, or the two powers, as it were. So, that is the general news I had for Europe. I'll move on to some of the news out of the US now. So, starting with the, in my opinion, what is much less interesting, UFO shootdowns. Now, to clarify, I think what a lot of people have forgotten over the years is that a UFO is quite literally an unidentified flying object. That doesn't necessarily mean it's an extraterrestrial craft. That doesn't mean we're being invaded by flying saucers or any of that kind of thing. Now, I have my skepticism of the existence of quote-unquote aliens in the first place. Now, although I may personally hold the beliefs that any sort of alien apparitions are probably demonic in nature, I'm not here to lecture you in theology. I'm far from qualified to do that. But putting that aside, I also have a much more, I guess you could say, secular explanation as to why I don't believe that. And that is actually from Edward Snowden. Now, Snowden, biggest leaker in American history, said that when he went through the documents that he leaked massive amounts of information from both the NSA and the CIA, that he found no records of at least them discovering alien or extraterrestrial involvement in anything involving UFOs. And he said that was actually one of the first things that he had looked for. So, I stake a lot of my belief on what Snowden has to say because of who he is and what he's exposed. And I think he's a pretty reliable source insofar as something like that is concerned. But you had, of course, the initial Chinese balloon that was confirmed to be a Chinese balloon that was down over the Atlantic Ocean after spending a weekend cruising across American skies. Then you had an unidentified object in Alaska downed. Then you had an unidentified object in Canada downed. And then you had the object over Lake Huron in the U.S. And it has been... There's really no winning narrative for the powers that be right now, because they can either admit that it's something far more sinister, that it's either a foreign power with some advanced aircraft that they're flying over, so that the U.S. is under a genuine threat, or that it's, I don't know, maybe some sort of like spooky alien invasion. I don't know. But, or they can admit it's just complete incompetence. Now, one of the things they did come out with is they said they did not have U.S. radar acclimated to track slow moving objects. So, for all we know, that this has been happening for years, and they're just now telling us that this is happening. And the National Weather Service also claimed responsibility for one of the objects that was shot down, saying it was theirs. So now we have, if that's the case, the U.S. opening fire on U.S. civilian research projects, which cracks me up, to be fair. And they describe these as like lighter with air, no propulsion systems. They sounded like, and although they denied using the term, balloons. And what I can really make of this now, there are people who will say it's a distraction, it's a distraction. While I do sympathize with that, I do think that there can be simultaneous stories that divide the attention of people. That's just the way people are. And while I am not anti-conspiracy theorist, I think most conspiracy theories have this, let's say, rose-colored vision of the world that if you, the people, just wake up, we can all band together in a grassroots movement and stop the nefarious plot. So I think when it comes to a lot of that, like, it's a lot of that is just hot air. No pun intended with the whole balloon thing. That it's a quote unquote distraction. Well, I do think that the media does come with distraction. I do think that they do have narratives. I think it's also simultaneously possible for attention to be divided and for people to focus on different things. And what I would make of this, I do think that the media is, of course, playing into the sensation of this. I think the U.S. government, I have seen speculations that, I mean, especially after the Chinese balloon, they could use this as a false flag for increased pressure on China, if not outright conflict. Or I would say what's much more likely at this point is sanctions. We have already tried to sanction the balloon manufacturers in China after the first shoot down, but it is it opens a world of possibilities for the people who would like to continue the empire down a very dangerous course for, frankly, the entire world. And that is what I make of the UFO story. I'll be honest, I don't have much of an investment in this beyond how absurd it has been. And I do think it's part of a larger story of American domestic decline. Now, I think you could also very easily couple that with some of the train derailments and infrastructure problems that we have had recently. Now, many have claimed that the UFOs were a distraction from the East Palestine, Ohio train derailments. And I think they're actually more interrelated. I do think they're both signs of American domestic and industrial and infrastructure decline, for that matter. So, I'll start with the East Palestine train derailments, because that was the big story. Now, this actually happened in my state. It happened on the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. So, I was out and about Saturday, February 3rd, and I was at lunch. And the place I was having lunch at was running a statewide television network that they have in Ohio. And it was reporting on the initial train derailment. Now, the initial train derailment happened on Friday the 3rd, and this was February the 4th when I had saw this news report. So there were initial evacuations because this was carrying vinyl chloride, which is a toxic chemical, not to be confused with polyvinyl chloride, which is what a PVC pipe is. And now it goes in the process of making it, but I'm no chemist here. But they are distinct things, and the trains were carrying vinyl chloride. Now, there have been many trying to say that this is not important, this is a nothing burger, this isn't going to be any sort of ecological disaster. Now, keep in mind where this happened. They did a controlled burn of this. They said everything was fine. And then animals and fish show up dead. Now, that's never a good sign, no matter who you are. Of course, most animals and sea life, for that matter, and just water life in general, they have a much lower tolerance for toxins than, say, the human body does. The human body truly amazing machine. I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you that. Yeah, it's able to take a lot of abuse. But it does raise questions as to what the health effects years down the road will be. So after you had the governors of Ohio and Pennsylvania come out and say, this was a successful operation, doing the controlled burn was the safest thing because it would have exploded and toxins would have been released anyway. You now have them reneging on their word after you've had people getting sick and animals dying, and that is Ohio Governor Mike DeWine and Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, respectively. Now, fingers have been pointed for blame all around. A lot of people are eager to blame Norfolk Southern, which is the rail line that this accident occurred with. And while I do think the railroad companies do shoulder quite a bit of the blame, it is part of a greater degradation of American infrastructure because there's been people blaming the Department of Transportation under the leadership, of course, the wonderful Pete Buttigieg, or however the hell you pronounce his name, and him taking his quote-unquote paternity leave in his very high demanding job. Not that I have any problem with people taking time off for their kids and their family, contingent that, it's actual family, if you're picking up what I'm putting down, and that you don't have a crucial job such as Secretary of Transportation. So, just to give credence to the people who have laid the blame on him and the Biden administration, since he has assumed office with the Biden administration in January of 2021, we've had gas prices go through the roof, which is more of a question of energy policy than the transportation, but still. We have a diesel shortage, also more of a matter of energy, but still. We have had the airports completely shut down, freeze up for a day. That was about a month ago. We've had now multiple train derailments because when you look at this story, you actually go back a few months to October 2022. You had a train derailment around the city of Sandusky, Ohio, which is a port city on Lake Erie. You've had a train derailment in Ravenna, Ohio, which is just outside of the Akron area. And then you have the one in East Palestine. And then that's followed up with derailments in South Carolina and Texas after the East Palestine issue. And then, as of today, a derailment in Detroit, Michigan. So, that leaves two equally frightening possibilities. There is some organization, whether it be foreign or domestic, that has committed itself to sabotage of the American railway. I'm not discounting that. Or American infrastructure has degraded to the degree that trains can no longer stay on the tracks as it is. And I can tell you, as somebody who's driven around a lot of rural Midwestern roads, the railroad quality, at least at the crossings, are not the best. That I can imagine it probably causes tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of car damage a year across the country when it comes to unsafe railroad crossings. But, of course, multiple things can be true at once. There could be some sort of act of sabotage. Now, I have no evidence to support that, so I am more inclined to dismiss that. I'm more inclined to place blame on Norfolk Southern for not taking proper care of this. Of course, they've been able to evade strike negotiations with the help of the federal and several state governments, mind you. So the blame is not to be pointed at one place here. The Biden administration broke up railroad strikes back in November and December. And also, this is the same government that has passed $1 trillion in infrastructure this year, not to mention they had roughly $1 trillion in infrastructure improvement under the Trump administration as well. Now, for any of you who know anything about government spending, of course, this is just a lot of lining the pockets of people who are lucky enough to have government contracts, as it were. Whether that be state governments, state officials, bureaucrats, government contractors, whatever. So, when it comes to the trillions of dollars we've poured into infrastructure since 2017, and even going back further than that, a lot of that clearly has not been spent properly or not been executed properly in terms of the construction, to the point where we are having trains derail several times now. Now, when it comes to that and some of the food processing plants that have been set fire to, it is very easy to go down a path of starting to assume maliciousness. Now, some people speculate, and I'm honestly sympathetic to, but not entirely sold on, that there are elements out there, whether that be people in this government or some sort of, I guess, say, lack of a better term, globalist agenda, which, don't get me wrong, do exist, to sabotage the what remains of the independent lifestyle, whether that comes to home farming, and also sabotage the food supply when it comes to having easy access to cheap food and trying to really corral the people, keep them. Once again, how the U.S. is keeping Europe, their neck barely above the water, where they can still function, they can still live their lives, but there's really no mobility for them to the point where they are stuck as debt slaves and they are stuck doing the menial jobs that they need to continue the very parasitic system that has been established for the past, I I would say, 70 years at least. You could probably go a little bit back further, but that really went into overdrive in the 80s and the 90s, especially with agreements like NAFTA and the opening up of the quote-unquote global markets. So you could very easily attribute to that. I would have to hold off before I would sign on to that, but I mean, it's undeniable that there are people, either by this means or other means, that are trying to degrade the population in order to turn them into, once again, those people who aren't really going to have any upward mobility and are going to do what they need to in order to keep the cash flowing for the parasitic class, as it were. Now, not every ruling class is parasitic by definition, but it seems that most of the ruling classes in the world today just so happen to be parasitic, which I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions on that. Certainly have my conclusions on that. But in terms of a major chemical spill, I don't see this one being deliberate. Of course, there were people saying that this was deliberate. I don't think so. Now, of course, they are trying to downplay the damage, and as time goes on, they increasingly admit more, where you had the Ohio Governor DeWine come out saying, oh, it's completely safe now, we've tested the air, everything's fine. And then saying, we're going to continue to test the air and the water. Keep in mind, as I had said, this city is 14 miles from the Ohio River, which is a major water source for millions of people in the country. And that flows into, of course, the Great Mississippi River, which is the lifeblood of America. The reason which its geography is so unmatched by the rest of the world. The Mississippi River and the tributary systems that flow off from that. So keep that in mind. While I wouldn't put it past them to allow environmental damage in pursuit of some greater goal, and while I wouldn't pass them to deliberately degrade the lifestyle of the average American, perhaps it was just a plot that got out of hand, but I don't foresee that. I see this as a genuine accident that can be chalked up to the degradation of infrastructure, because I can't really see the motive behind this, dumping such massive amounts of chemical into the ground, possibly into the water, and burning it into the air. Because even if they do want to control the vast farmlands of, say, like the Midwest or something like that, it isn't going to do them a damn thing if it's all irradiated and completely infertile. Now, I don't think it is going to be that case. I do think there are a lot of doomsayers on this, but there is probably going to be a lot of long-lasting environmental damage to this area for years to come. And as somebody even within the vicinity of it, living in the same state, I'll admit I'm a bit uncomfortable with this, and I've never had a stronger urge to just get in my car, pick an interstate, and drive west. And who knows, if the situation continues to degrade, I may choose to do so. Or I may choose to leave the North American continent altogether, depending on how the situation in Europe goes, but I'll keep my escape plans to myself and will not bore you with them, at least for this time. But what we can look forward to likely is that this is probably the last of these incidents, especially considering after the East Palestine incident. East Palestine, spelled like Palestine, like the Palestinian Authority, but the locals pronounce it Palestine, so I always try to go with the local pronunciation for these kind of things. I don't like to rock the boat with that too much. It's their city; they can really call it what they want. But with that being said, we've already had the derailments in Texas, South Carolina, and Detroit, as well as, although it was a highway accident, the highway accident in Tucson, Arizona, where you had a truck with hazardous material spill chemicals everywhere. So these events will continue, whether they're the act of maliciousness or just sheer degradation of American infrastructure and function of everyday public life and public services. I don't really think that matters at this point. While the situation in East Palestine may not be the American Chernobyl, it certainly is a harbinger of things to come. This will be far from the last of what's going to happen here. American infrastructure is at second world levels at best, and even sub-second world levels in some cases. And clearly, with the direction things are going, there is no concerted effort to have the improvement in American infrastructure. You had our wonderful transportation secretary, Pete Buttigieg, up at a conference talking about diversity in construction and infrastructure work while this situation was going on, while the fallout of this situation was going on, not to mention that. Now, I know that sounds like some sort of very basic partisan politics talking point, and frankly, it may be, but, and I don't think the GOP, I don't think any of Trump's or whatever transportation secretaries would have been much better on the issue. But point being is, it is just going to be continued neglect by the federal government, by the respective state governments, by the actual transportation companies, whether it be Norfolk Southern, other rail lines, other airlines, that these things are just going to progressively go more and more to shit because we have not properly trained people to maintain the system. And that's the real paradox of industrial civilization. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not on board with some of the primitive stuff, and I mean, I do see the consequences, for lack of a better term, and not to quote a certain piece of literature, of the Industrial Revolution. But I don't think it's a wholesale bad thing. But I do think it's paradoxical in terms of the people that are produced by a very comfortable industrial society are also not the people who are trained to maintain it. Because people get complacent, they don't teach things to future generations. You want a good example? NASA itself has admitted that they no longer are able to perform the kind of moon landing they did during the Apollo missions, that they have just lost that information since the 1960s, 1970s. So if that's happening in NASA, there's no reason to not believe that's happening in the military, in our infrastructure, in every facet of advanced modern life. And I wouldn't call myself entirely a naysayer on this, but or a doomsayer, I should say, but I'm sympathetic with the people who say that we're reaching a point within the next century or two where industrial civilization is just going to fall into complete disrepair. And I would argue a lot of American infrastructure has fallen into complete disrepair. That's, of course, true for other places around the world, but it does seem that other countries, as shoddy as their infrastructure may be, at least there is some sort of concern for the future and future plans for it. Now, I don't know, maybe America will have an engineering renaissance. Maybe we'll have very smart, highly intelligent, qualified Americans of a certain persuasion that, let's just say, founded the country. Perhaps we'll have a renaissance of them in the next generation or two who are going to overhaul American infrastructure. We're going to really put pen to paper and take care of this and not turn it into a bureaucratic nightmare. Or perhaps we'll get stuck with more people who are hired for political favors and for affirmative action reasons rather than competence, and we'll continue to see American infrastructure degrade. But you can talk all day about the foreign policy of the American empire. I do. I do this show. I enjoy doing the show. I think that we cover important issues here. And I think there's a lot to be looked at in places like Europe, Asia, Middle East, etc. But I think the real downfall of the American empire will be in its internal degradation of infrastructure. Keep in mind, while at this point at least, the civic nationalist American identity is somewhat in existence. Now that is slowly degrading every day as the demographics do change and as the founding stock of America is much more alienated from its own nation. But for the point being, there haven't really been distinct, geographically specific ethnic or cultural identities to spring up out of America. Now that could be, but a large part of that is because the Federation of America, particularly the lower 48, are completely intertwined. They're made completely codependent upon each other. Which is why you'll see this a lot from a lot of blue staters saying, well, we subsidize these red states so much, and then the red staters will say, well, look, we produce all the agricultural goods, and we're part of the manufacturing industry, and then it's just this back and forth, back and forth. The point being is, they're made dependent on each other by Washington, D.C., because without that, especially with the political polarization now, there is no other incentive beyond basic material needs that this country has to say as a unified federation. As the days go on, now, perhaps there was a time, especially, I would say, post-World War II, especially enjoying that quote-unquote American Golden Age, I would say 1945 to 1965, where there was that genuine unity of the nation, that there was that Pan-American identity across the continent. But while that hasn't entirely died, it is being chipped at more and more every day. To the point where, under what other circumstances would California and Nebraska have to be under the same polity? Other than they're both reliant on the federal government to get each other's resources, whether that be, say, the agricultural goods from somewhere like Nebraska, or and perhaps California is a bad example because they do have a substantial agricultural industry, but let's say New York, or the financial and political power that comes out of somewhere like New York. They're made explicitly codependent on each other. And as American infrastructure degrades, the bond between those will degrade. Because although, to the chagrin of many, we don't have a national rail system, now I imagine a lot of people will probably sour on the idea of a national rail system as these derailments do continue. But point being is, you can hop on a plane, you can hop on an interstate, you can hop on a Greyhound, and be anywhere in the lower 48 within 2 days, more or less. And that's if you do the speed limit, and of course I would never encourage anyone, but point being is, it's very easy at this point to travel across the North American continent, and even into Canada as well. The border security isn't very, let's say, stringent, especially compared to a lot of other international borders around the world. But as that infrastructure degrades, as those interstates become, let's just say, less maintained and more dangerous to drive on, as the airports become less functional. I mean, there's already also been stories out of just the aviation industry these past few weeks that really cast, I mean, especially with the unidentified flying objects in the sky that probably, in commercial aircraft space no less, has probably put a damper on many people's desire to take a flight somewhere. So as all these factors do continue to boil over, the idea of American unity becomes less and less, because after a certain point, when you start to sever even those physical bonds, especially, I should say, between these very disparate states, after a certain point, they become just less dependent on each other. And we'll see the fallout of that. I'm not necessarily saying I want to see all of this come tumbling down, but I do think, especially if American infrastructure continues as it is going to be an inevitability rather than a possibility. But that's all I had for the news on that. And I'll just cover some brief news about the expansion of BRICS and some other stories here just to round out the show. So, you've had the application of both Saudi Arabia and Iran to BRICS, and that's on top of, as we've covered previously, Algeria, Argentina. Turkey has also applied to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but this growing of this alternative power bloc. And you had statements by Lavrov about Saudi Arabia in particular, about the deepening strategic ties between the two countries. And he said that they are now strategic partners. Now, he didn't use the term allies, but he said strategic partners. And this is on top of the reconciliation with Iran on Saudi Arabia's part as well. And that you do have this continued expanding power block. And with that, 2023 will be crucial. The course of the Ukraine war will be crucial. I've said much of this before, but it does bear repeating. The Ukraine war is the battlefield. That is where people are actually fighting it out. But it does go beyond Ukraine, and I think people have always realized it always goes beyond Ukraine, because if Russia, even after some of the setbacks, can prove itself to have accomplished a military triumph over what amounts to a American and NATO proxy, it will have established itself in a whole new light in the world. Which is why you have even the countries now, as the conflict is ongoing, trying to join these alternative organizations to the Western-backed institutions, think EU, NATO, UN, etc. But as that continues on, as Russia pushes forward, if they're successful in this conflict, then you're going to see likely what can only be described as an explosion of nations that are wanting to join. And once again, while these may be secondary and tertiary powers, while many people may write these off and say like, they're not significant, I mean, these countries do have strategic significance, resources, and like I said, while their population might not be the highest IQ, as it were, under proper guidance, once again, as we've seen time and time again, these populations that aren't necessarily as smart or as developed can be marshaled, especially if they're importing help from much more admittedly competent nations like Russia and China, if Russia and China are sending advisors there to oversee infrastructure projects, as they have in several places in Africa and Latin America, that this block will continue. And that 2023, in my opinion, is pivotal in terms of what we see here. That we're either going to get, once again, that 1,000-year Burger Reich, or we are going to get a completely reorganized global stage. And I would say we're leaning towards the latter as it is. But mind you, Ukraine has taken on such an artificial importance to the West because they have staked everything in it. If Ukraine fails, then the confidence in the American-led world order is completely shaken, even more than it already is, even more than it already has been over the past several years. But let's just say, by some stretch of the imagination, the West managed to marshal the Ukrainian forces, provides them with proper aid, support, etc. They managed to dislodge Russia and cause a political crisis there. Well, then, at that point, a similar fate probably isn't too far behind for China. These smaller nations, which have been coalescing around a Russian-Chinese power bloc, like we said, such as these nations that are trying to join BRICS and the SCO, are likely either going to fall in line or face regime change. I mean, they've already been presented with that, but at this point there is an alternative to those options. But after that point, there would really be no substantive alternative. So, with that, it becomes really Ukraine has gone from what in all likelihood should have just been an ethnic border skirmish into something that the American empire has staked its entire power base on, and that it really can't afford to lose, which is why many do fear this war escalating, even though, as men like Ben Wallace and Stoltenberg have said, love him or hate him, NATO's not in a condition to fight a war with Russia. Now, I know Russia, like I said, they're probably not in a condition with war with NATO either, but they've managed to keep their arms stockpiles much higher than, say, Ukraine, and even the West, which isn't directly involved in this conflict. So, the advantage, while many may have doubted at first, does very well lie with Russia if it does come to this. And the Russian economy doesn't seem to have been shaken. In fact, they're outperforming the German economy actually as a result of the sanctions. Now, they are trying to expand the sanctions to affect the Russian tech sector, which is probably the one area they could hit Russia hard. But with that, you have the Chinese tech sector right next door, and the Chinese who are already crawling all over Western institutions, Western companies, who have been developing their own alternative tech as a result of the information that they have garnered from that and from their own ingenuity, as in their own right. They're developing a comparable tech sector. Now, some people would say that might increase Russian reliance on China, which it would, but I still think you look at how it balances out on a scale. Chinese dependence on Russia is probably still far more than Russian dependency on China. But point being is, if you were one to deprive them of that, you would need to target the Chinese tech sector, which is a monumental task. I would say even beyond Western sanctions. Anything involving the West and Chinese sanctions, because the economies are still so intertwined, is a very dangerous prospect, and is not something to be taken lightly. And perhaps if war with Taiwan does break out, then we will see that. But at this point, they're trying to hit the Russian tech sector while they can, because it's coming very close to a world where they don't need to. And once again, there also are third parties that Russia could access the Western tech markets through, whether that be through India, say Turkey, even like a country small as Serbia in that regard could serve potentially as a middleman. But I would say especially India and Turkey in that regard are valuable middlemen. Neither of which the West is too eager to isolate. Now Turkey, they do have their scopes at a bit more on, and as we see in the upcoming elections, there probably will be an attempt at that. But India, especially, although it has drifted more towards Russia and China, is still a country at this point they're not going to risk isolating. So it really is a last opportunity to cripple the Russian tech sector, and they're taking it while they can. Will it succeed? I think out of any of the sanctions packages that they have imposed so far, which I think at this point there are, you collectively count all of them, about 13,000 sanctions on Russia as a whole, whether that be on a national, corporate, governmental, or individual level. But it still hasn't shaken them. It may set them behind, but once again, this is a much different world than 2008. This is a much different world than 2014, to the point where there all are alternatives, and the Russians also are not a dumb people. They, especially given the opportunity to develop, whether that be through cooperation with China, other powers, or corporate and industrial espionage, they are probably capable of maintaining, maybe not as good as a tech sector, but a tech sector that can really service the needs of its people and its security interests. So, while I do think that this is probably the most effective sanctions could be at striking a blow at the heart of Russia, I still think it's something that is too little too late for this, and that I think it's really all just been too little too late when it comes to confrontation with Russia. The West was not adamant enough in 2014. That was probably the last chance they had to dislodge them from any sort of hope of returning to global prominence. But at this point, while there may have been some setbacks, Russia's just a force they're either going to have to contend with or bring about the apocalypse trying to prevent, which, I mean, again, unless they're going to take to, nuclear war, which goes back to the whole apocalyptic thing, it's just something they're going to have to learn to contend with. And I will leave you all with just a brief update on the Syria and Turkey earthquake. So, the death toll we have thus far out of Turkey is about 20,000, which is about double from when it first started, and about 1,500 thereabout from Syria in terms of the casualty rate. So these nations have been devastated. There have been political disputes over aid, especially with Syria. Now, there have been opportunities for European countries to actually send aid to Syria. You had Italy send aid to Syria, so they were able to buck that trend in Europe and get past sanctions in order to send aid to them. You have the ongoing negotiation with Turkey for aid, which are likely going to become very politicized, especially in the wake of the 2023 election. And as the emergency response does continue, it is going to be what is going to make or break Erdogan. And it's still too early to tell. The situation on the ground is still not good, but this is still a very recent event, so people are not quite pointing fingers yet. But as the situation does progress, I think we'll start to get a clearer picture on what exactly Erdogan's fate in all of this is going to be. And I do think that, especially with the growing anti-Western sentiments in Turkey, he will be able to turn this around in the West and say they didn't provide proper aid and that I'm doing the best I can for my people and that's why you should re-elect me. I think he'll be able to successfully spin that narrative, but there's going to be a lot working against him, and there is going to be a lot of what is probably going to amount to a color revolution in terms of protests, that they're going to take full advantage of this situation. They're going to take full advantage of this, and they're likely going to exacerbate the situation in Turkey, trying to make it more painful for the people. Now, I've been on the record that I don't necessarily like Turkey as a polity, nor do I like Erdogan necessarily, but they're going to make him right by doing this. And Turkey's a volatile force. It could go either way, which is why, by hook or crook, the West is going to do everything they can to bring Turkey back into their orbit, with or without Erdogan. And this election, especially in the aftermath of this crisis, is going to be crucial. So there is going to be a lot of just mudslinging and dirty tricks all around, even down to the point where it affects aides of people who have lost everything because of this earthquake. So they're going to be the real victims in all of this at the point of political games. As much as like I would love to blame Erdogan, not being that much of a fan of the guy, after a certain point, it is incumbent on the West to have been to be the ones who are going to, in all likelihood, exacerbate the situation. They are going to put their NGOs on the ground, and they're going to. It wouldn't shock me if they withhold aid in some cases in order to try to inflame the political situation, because that's the point it's come to now. But we'll, of course, have more updates on that next week. And thank you all for tuning in to this slightly shorter episode of the War Report. I hope I covered everything as good as I could on my own without the assistance of a co-host. But GSP will be back soon, and hopefully we'll have a few more guests on the pipe in the coming weeks. But we'll see what the future holds for all of us. So I will see you guys next time, and goodbye.